Hello, everyone. Welcome to Econ 2111. So, today we're entering the topic of the economic history of Upper Canada. And Upper Canada is the neighbor of Lower Canada, which kind of should be somewhat evident from the description. Uh, but the interesting difference here is that we're going to use the case of Upper Canada as a comparison to Lower Canada. And the reason why I say comparison is because if you remember from the last lecture on the seigneurial regime in Lower Canada, the argument that we had made was that the particular institution of seigneurial tenure within that colony had a big impact in determining the gap in living standards. And we had tied this to the idea of that one particular institution explains the vast majority of the living standards differences between Canada and the United States because Quebec is so big. So, Quebec being Lower Canada. Now, what we're going to do is look at the neighbor of Lower Canada, Upper Canada, and we're going to try and see how well it did economically, and we're going to use its performance as as a way to kind of confirm the role that the institution may have played in determining the entire difference between Canada and the United States. Okay, so first and foremost, what we're going to do is just do a short description of what Upper Canada is, and then the explanations for why it was a relatively rich place, because that's what we're going to see in the first part, is that Upper Canada is a very rich colony by the standards of the time, and then we're going to try and understand why it is. So just to give you a map so you can picture what it is. So this is the map of North America, but like with a zoom on the New England states. So you got New York right here, and you can see it, New York. You got New Hampshire right there. You got Vermont here. You have Maine, and you can see Massachusetts. If you go down a bit, you have Pennsylvania. You see a tidbit of Ohio. That should give you an idea of where it is in the United States. And from there, you can also see the big St. Lawrence River, and everything in pink here is Lower Canada, also known as Quebec, or before in the previous lecture, New France. So this is pretty much that area where the French people are predominantly located. And Upper Canada is this green bit right here, which is basically where we are at King's University College. We're right here pretty much. And so Upper Canada is that portion of Canada which is known as Ontario today. But back then it didn't go as far north as the Hudson Bay. It pretty much ended right next to Lake Huron. So that being said, that area, what do we know about its economic history? Well, the first thing that kind of has to be said is that the area is settled initially by Americans who remained loyal to the British Crown. So when the Americans decided to have the little insurgency and revolt against the king, show how ungrateful they were. This is me just teasing Americans here. And their little revolution led to independence. A large number of Americans remained loyal to the crown, and many of them moved north to Canada. Some of them settled in New Brunswick, but a much larger proportion, and there were some of them who also settled in Lower Canada and hashtag Quebec. Uh, but the vast majority went to Upper Canada, which is modern day Ontario, as I said. That really first rapid initial boom in terms of population was rapidly followed by immigrants from the British Isles, and that's basically Wales, England, Scotland, and Ireland, who start immigrating, as well as other Americans who don't leave for political reasons. They leave mostly for economic ones, largely the attraction of the Canadian frontier at that point in time. And the immigration is not small. It's a really important immigration that goes there. And in the span of 6 decades, the population of Upper Canada goes from roughly 70,000 to 1.3 million, which is pretty fast. So just to give you an idea, this is the level of immigration annually. So new people who settle in the colony. Just to give you an idea, this spike here, that's the Irish famine that causes like a really rapid influx. But these are big numbers. We're talking an extra 100,000 people in 1 year who enter Canada, and generally it's always an extra 20,000 every year in a society that as a whole doesn't exceed 2 million people. And you have to remember that each of these individuals, you say 20,000 ish after the 1830s who arrive, uh, they tend to have a larger number of kids than is realized. And this fuels the overall increase in population that adds to those who are already present and having families themselves. So what you see here is the increase in population from this 70,000 that I mentioned earlier in 1806, which is the first census estimate that we have, and until 1861, which is when it's 1.3 million souls. This is a very rapid increase in population. And just to give you an idea of how big of an increase this is less than 6 decades. In fact, I said 6 decades, but it's actually a bit less than that. The American colonies to the south didn't reach a million people in 6 decades. It took them roughly a bit more, close to a century of, of population growth to reach a million people. So this should tell you something already. This is a phenomenal level of population growth. And it's very rapid and it's very, well, I say very unprecedented. That's not necessarily good English on my part, but it is unprecedented. It's exceptionally unprecedented. Sense that you may have had like cases that look close to resembling this, but very, uh, I haven't found one example of such a rapid pace of population growth in such a short time span. And just that, by the way, should already be indicative of where we're going to go regarding economic growth. Because if you remember from lecture 8, when we had discussed New France, I had pointed out that when you live in a world that, say for the sake of argument, doesn't have any form of very rapid technological improvements, which would mean it's one of those Malthusian world that we had discussed in lecture 5. Well, that Malthusian world in New France didn't really had any relevancy. The reason why was that there was so much land available and so few people relative to that land that the Malthusian constraint of reaching like very rapidly decreasing marginally decreasing returns, when you have so few people relative to the amount of land, the problem of marginally decreasing returns was essentially not irrelevant. That there's always marginally decreasing returns. It's just that these marginally decreasing returns to land were more than outweighed by some additional benefits from having more population. And that is, for example, the fact that when you have more people in a given society, you also have lower costs on average of producing public goods, but public goods still produce the same benefit regardless of the amount of population. In fact, it grows linearly with population. So there was some advantages of having larger populations on the one hand. So that's one of the things we saw. One of the other things we saw that led to population growth being beneficial in a world that is very far from the Malthusian one is that when you have more and more people, you have more and more room for specialization. And that's because more and more people means larger markets. Larger markets imply that it's possible to make a living from a very specialized activity. But specializing in what you do best in your comparative advantage also means greater productivity. And greater productivity means higher living standards. So just the fact that we observe this really rapid population growth suggests that it there cannot be an explanation that uh, living standards would have fallen. In fact, we should suggest that it's probably very high in this world where there's so much land available that the Malthusian constraint is pretty much irrelevant in that situation. Even that's even if we had assumed that there was no technological innovation at that period, there are clear signs that there was some technological innovation that would have made the Malthusian world even less relevant. So, which would only accentuate the point that an increase in population stimulates by itself economic activity in this case. And so, what we observe in Upper Canada, sorry, is uh, we do observe signs of increasing economic activity. So here is some evidence that we have regarding net farm income. And this is net farm income per capita uh, deflated. So this is the real net farm income per capita. So this is from 1826 to 1851. And yes, there are downs, right? But there is still a positive trend upwards where there is some form of economic growth that appears to emerge. And I think this graph here is understating things because here we're taking only net farm income. And the problem was there's twofold comments. Is the source I'm using for this points out that the enumerators from the censuses that are being used undercounted certain forms of farm production so that the level should be a bit higher than where it is now. But there's also the fact that this is me taking the entire production of the farm sector and divide it over the entire population of Upper Canada, regardless of whether or not they're farmers. Uh, Although there's the proper measure that they should have used had it been available would have been to divide the net farm income by farm household or farm workforce to get an idea of productivity. The problem is that there is no very consistent estimates of that agricultural workforce. But the idea is that the trend is that the agricultural workforce as a share of the total population is actually declining over time. So had I been able to have a measure of the non-farm workforce, the trend would be even more pronounced upward. So maybe so first of all, the level would be up massively, but not only would it be up, but it'd probably be like a steeper upward curve between the start point and the end point. So this is like a very conservative assessment of a very conservative picture of the economic growth that Upper Canada enjoyed. But it's not just that Upper Canada is enjoying improvements in living standards. It's also that because it'd be very unsurprising if a poor place grows relatively fast. For anyone who's done their principles of macro, you've seen that it's actually expected that poor countries should enjoy faster growth than rich countries, largely because capital goes to where adding one unit of capital creates the greatest returns. And generally, because poor countries are less productive, that means that's where the greatest gains in adding capital to the economy are the greatest because that's where you get the greatest marginal returns to an extra unit of capital. But had it been that Ontario, Upper Canada, was poor, then that growth rate should not be that surprising. But actually, Upper Canada is actually a very rich place, suggesting that it should, just by virtue of being relatively rich, should already have signs of, slightly slower economic growth. And the fact of the matter is, when we start digging into the available data, is it's very clear that Upper Canada is very rich, especially when we compare to Lower Canada. And this is just to give you an illustration. This is from some of my work on comparing Upper and Lower Canada. And here what you have is different sources that provide the day wage rate, so how much a person earns per day of work. And this one is, by the way, the one on top is the nominal wage rate. So that's like, just there's no deflation. We haven't deflated for uh, the wages so that they become real wages. I haven't corrected for inflation essentially. And so these are the periods. So these are the sources that I'm using. These are the years to which they apply. And this is the ratio of Upper Canada over Lower Canada. And what this says here is that the nominal wages in Lower Canada, sorry, in Upper Canada, were somewhere between 13 and 16% higher than they were uh, in Upper Canada, and then in Lower Canada. Sorry, so this is an advantage of at least 13% over Lower Canada. But this is an understatement because the cost of living in Upper Canada at that point in time, especially for items that weighed very heavily in the baskets, the consumer baskets, or what people would consume on a daily basis, the vast majority of these goods were much cheaper in Upper Canada than in Lower Canada. So that when you adjust for the differences in the cost of living, the gap, rather than being between 13 and 16% in favor of Upper Canada, goes to somewhere between 18 and 42% greater in Upper Canada than in Lower Canada. And still, that column is still conservative because Upper Canada had, at least apparently, and we'll see why in a few minutes, uh, had the ability to work longer work years so that the day wages don't actually perfectly capture the annual income differences that people would have. So this is like kind of a low bound estimate of the differences between Upper and Lower Canada. So the another sign that Upper Canada is very rich relative to Lower Canada, and this is related to something that historians of Canada used to bemoan and say this was bad, it wasn't good, it was a sign of like poverty. And but actually, if you're an economist, you understand that this is a sign of incredible economic dynamism. And what used to be bemoaned, but is actually a sign of great dynamism, was the fact that when immigrants arrived to Upper Canada, they had to work a few years in Upper Canada in order to acquire a farm, so to settle on the frontier with a new plot of land. So that means that somebody from Britain would come in say 1820, and when they arrived, they had to pay their way first, but they would work like 1 or 2 years, earning extra cash, and as a result, would then be able to purchase a farm or purchase the goods that they need to withstand the first years of opening their farm. Now, I say withstand the first years of opening their farm because what you have to understand that period is that um, when you were clearing virgin land, your farm was producing nothing for like the first year. So in your first year of no production, you have essentially a form of problem where you still have to consume stuff to stay alive. Or I mean, you have to consume some elements of a diet, and you have to feed yourself, you have to clothe yourself. So there's still expenditures that need to be had, and you need to keep doing so until your farm reaches a certain level of maturity where the farm generates enough income for you to start saving and accumulating for this saving you had done while you were clearing your farm. So it's basically like a form of investment. It's just in this case, there were no banks to go and see and borrow from to open your farm in the first few years. But now let's consider the mechanism that, like, the decisions that immigrants faced. When immigrants from Britain or the United States arrived in Canada, the first thing that they had to do, just before arriving, in fact, was to purchase their way through. So they had to buy like a boat ticket to cross the Atlantic. And that may seem like it's not a big deal, but it's a huge deal, because sometimes these tickets cost for them, for all that they brought with them, roughly a year of income. And that's including the cost of the time that they're not working while they're crossing the sea. So first of all, just the cost of moving is very expensive. And remember that to that cost of moving, there's also the extra savings that they need to withstand like the first few years of farm making, right? So when they're opening their farm, which is known as farm making, you still have to like basically consume, but you're not earning anything yet. So you must have accumulated some savings to withstand the first years. This is a huge first cost of making the move. But notice something here. If you're an immigrant and you're leaving a low wage economy and you move to another place which has much higher wages, well that basically means that as long as I pay my way and cross the Atlantic and I want to accumulate the savings to open my farm, well then I don't need to work as much to accumulate the amount of savings that I need, because now I'm working at higher wage rates. In this situation, it means that actually the cost of migration is reduced from the immigrant's perspective, because there's a vibrant labor market that allows them to work for a few years and accumulate the savings they need to open their first farm more rapidly. So they accumulate the savings more rapidly than had they stayed, say, in England or Ireland or Scotland or Wales. So that actually means that, so even though the historians are bemoaning the fact that the immigrants have to work a few years when they arrive, it's actually a sign of economic dynamism that there's such opportunities for employment. And bear in mind that when we were talking about Lower Canada, one of the problems in Lower Canada that came from the regime of seigneurial tenure is the fact that the employers, the seigneur, which controlled pretty much entry in the non-farm products market. So to a high degree, that meant that they were basically able to, because they had market power on the product sides, they also had basically a certain amount of market power in terms of the demand for labor. And that meant that monopsony, because that's what it is. If you have market power over demand, if you're the sole demander, for example, that means that you can actually, you act like a monopsonist, right? Monopsony. In that situation, you actually are going to reduce wages and you're going to reduce the amount of people that you hire. So one of the reasons that Upper Canada was so attractive is it didn't have that institution of seigneurial tenure that that made it possible for immigrants to make the move more easily and to settle the land. Whereas Lower Canada, with the institution of seigneurial tenure, was much less attractive to immigrants because that vibrant labor market that hired large quantities of workers for off-season work, for occasional labor, were unavailable. This market was unavailable, and such there was there was less attractiveness to move to Lower Canada. So actually, it's a sign of great dynamism that you see immigrants working a few years to accumulate savings faster than had they stayed in England. And the other part that's really interesting that like confirms that there is a faster level uh, uh, of economic activity than in Lower Canada is that the high level of non-farm employment that was available made farm settlement easier. Because in addition to the effect that I've just mentioned for immigrants, there's another effect that's really important. Remember that I mentioned that there's the cost of opening your farm. So for the first year or the first few years, you're not earning much from your farm. And in fact, probably your costs are greater than your revenues from whatever you do on your farm. So the first few years are horrible. And that means you have to have a lot of savings. But if you understand anything about the reality of farming, especially the reality of farming in Canada, say like during winter, nothing happens on a farm in winter. That basically means that you have labor that is somewhat vacant and unemployed, essentially, in in winter or in off periods when there's nothing the farm can do. So you're just waiting for the crops to grow. So you have like some free time that you could allocate for occasional work. And the reason why this is important is if there's a labor market that is available to work. So there's always the option of providing a day of work here or there to that industry or that industry to do like some daily work for a week, like helping on building the road or like taking some occasional contract shipbuilding or helping the guy at the lumber camp fell some wood. If you have this option to work occasionally, it's like basically like you'd be like doing with Uber, right? So you basically just say, okay, so today I don't have anything to do with the farm. I'm just waiting for the crop to grow. Just like you say today, I have nothing to do, so I'm going to go take my car and do some Ubering. Well, the people back then, what they were saying was, well, I have nothing to do today. I can at least go and offer my work to the lumber camp a few miles away. So I'll walk over there and offer to work 3 or 4 days there, helping them cut the timber and in exchange be paid something. Well, the reason why this is important is because it would increase the revenue of the farm household during the early years. So that actually means something really important is if you have that option of outside work on an occasional basis, the cost of making the move is lowered. So there's something really neat that's happening. If there's a vibrant market for non-farm work next to a market next to farms, having that vibrant market for non-farm work increases productivity or increases production in the farm sector because now it's actually cheaper to open your farm and to like settle it at a faster pace or even to open like to move to make the decision to open a farm. So in the very very weird way, the availability of working on an occasional basis. So another name that's been given for that in economic history is proto industries, right? So like PROTO industries. So this is like occasional work on rural cotton industry. So this is like, there's like a little carding mill in this area. There's a lumber camp that cuts the wood very roughly. There is a flour mill, and the miller needs someone to carry some of the milled grains, whatever it is, right? So there's a series of small rural industries that are available. If there's a large number of them, it actually makes the farm sector more productive by having this ability to move between places, but also to clear land at a faster rate because it's more attractive to move. So there's that combination of effect that allows output to grow very fast in Upper Canada in this period. And so it's a very exceptional outcome that you see because this combination not only leads to Upper Canada being richer by a very wide amount, a very wide proportion than Lower Canada, you actually can re-express it relative to the United States. And you see that actually Upper Canada is pretty much as rich as some of the richest places in the United States. So here, what you have is the grain wage. So this is the wages deflated by the price of wheat, which is the only thing that is available. So grain wage in place I, so that would be South Carolina, Maryland, Lower Canada, Vermont, Pennsylvania, and New York, divided by Upper Canada, UC, Upper Canada. So this is basically a ratio column. So when we say South Carolina at 65%, that means that the grain wages for day work in South Carolina were 65% of those of Upper Canada. Now, Lower Canada is pretty much as poor as the slave states of the South, but it is poorer than all the free states of the American North, and Upper Canada is in the upper crust of American states. So New York is at that point in time one of the richest the richest states in the American Union. And Lower Canada, it's a bit poorer than New York, but it's not far behind. So Upper Canada is a very rich place within North America. And that last table I've shown you, this one, is actually very, very important, because not only does it point to the economic dynamism and how much like Upper Canada was able to be a very rich place, it also allows us to contextualize our findings with regards to Upper and Lower Canada. So the wage difference between Upper and Lower Canada, shown in this table here, right? This one here. If we use it in conjunction with the demographic weight that Upper Canada has as a share of Canada, this is the 35.3 here. So Lower Canada is 35.3% of all of Canada. So that's Upper, Lower Canada plus New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. That 35.3% of the population is basically a weight that we can apply to the gap between Quebec and Ontario. What do I mean by that? Well, let's just take what the income difference is for Canada as a whole. So that's the end of the bullet, that's the third bullet point here. When you take Canada as a whole, the level of per capita income is $1,965 for 1840. That's the GDP per capita of Canada. That $1,965 is 76% of the level observed in the United States. So it's basically a gap of 25% pretty much. But now let's remove Quebec from this, knowing how poor it is. That means that you deflate the population by 35% and you deflate the income level by the difference between Ontario and Quebec. And when you do that, you end up that the Canada without Quebec, right? So this is this line here is Canada when Quebec is excluded. The per capita income is $2,256, which is roughly 87% of the gap between the United States and Canada. So sorry, it's not 87% of the gap between the United States and Canada. It's 80%. The level of GDP per capita in Canada is 87% of the level in the United States. The difference between these two numbers is how much of the gap between Canada, so the 76.1 and the 87.3, is what share of the difference between Canada and the United States is due to Quebec being so poor within Canada. which essentially means that, heck, half the gap between Canada and the United States as a whole is due to Quebec, which is Lower Canada. That is massive. That is a massive finding, because you're saying that one place alone accounts for half of the income differences between a country and another. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. So with that being said, now that we've set the stage, why is Upper Canada such a rich place? One argument that used to be frequently advanced, and I think is rubbish, I'm just saying it out loud here, that's where we're going, is that Upper Canada had this advantage in geography. They had good land, and that good land meant that there were unequal beginnings, whereby for the settlers who arrived in Upper Canada, they could settle on more productive lands. They could more easily export to the British market because the lands were so much better. The costs of producing wheat were so much lower, which meant that they could outcompete the Lower Canada wheat. They could export more easily to Britain, to the United States. And so they could rely on a good endowment in terms of land quality to be super productive. So it has nothing to do with the institutions. According to that explanation, institutions have nothing to do. Economic practices have nothing to do. All it is, it's just like good land. Well, this can be true, right? It's not untrue that sometimes geography matters. But in this case, the differences are somewhat minimal. So the first part is when you compare the land quality. So this is the map of Upper Canada, and what you have here is how the land is expressed as in terms of its quality. The darker the land quality is, right, the less good it is. So the less good, that's a terrible sentence. The worse the land is. The clearer the color is, the better the land is. So here you can see that in at least like the vast majority of what is Upper Canada or Ontario today, the land quality is pretty good. And so the argument is that, look at all this good land right here. That's why Upper Canada is so productive. Well, first of all, there's a small problem with that. The first one is that when you compare with Lower Canada, this part here is where Lower Canada starts, and the Montreal area, where the vast majority of Lower Canada's population is, has pretty much the same land quality as Upper Canada. So it can't explain that much, right? Especially since the vast majority of agricultural production in Lower Canada takes place around the Montreal area. But the other part that should make us skeptical of that explanation is that econometric tests of this show that it doesn't hold ground. It's actually a very trivial explanation. This is work I've done that I'm doing right now. So I'm showing you preliminary results now with Louis Rouanet from George Mason University. And what we did is we assembled all the wage and price data from the 1842 censuses. And we drew around, because the wages were reported in different areas. So we had like parishes, townships. So they're different places. And because we have the wages there in each of these little markets, we can draw buffers around these places and know what is the quality of the land around each of those. And I say here an area of 50 squared kilometers. It's actually 20 squared kilometers. I made a typo on the slide. We're using a buffer of 20. And we estimated the quality of the land through the ruggedness of the terrain. So how suited is it for agricultural production for roughly 100 subdistricts in Lower and Upper Canada that provided with data. And so the result and the idea is we want to test whether the land quality affects the wages deflated by the price level. So that basically means the real wages in these areas. And what we find is that to some degree, yes, geography does matter, but it only matters when you don't properly control for things. Once you include the proper econometric controls, it actually dissipates as a relevant explanation. So just to show you what this looks like, the idea here is that all the spots in blue is places for which we have data about both wages and prices. So you have like a pretty big sample of observations available. And the big red places are big urban centers, essentially. Uh, so this is where like there's a large hub of population that lives in cities, and thus would be like a factor for the productivity of an area, because farms close to the city would produce for the city, and so would probably be a bit more productive because of that proximity to cities. But when we start checking the results, it's even without like doing like a very without showing you like the full table of regression results yet. I just want you to look at this graph, and you'll start seeing what's happened, like why the land quality story doesn't hold. So the line here, the red line, is basically the best fit between the real wages. So the way the real wages are expressed on this axis here, and the land quality is expressed on this axis here. And you can see that the idea is, by the way, that the greater the number right here, so there's kind of an inverse index, the greater the number, the worse the land quality, right? So if you're here, good land. If you're here, bad land. The idea here is that the worst lands have lower productivity. The best land have higher productivity. So yeah, it seems that geography matters. But the thing I did is that me and Louis, my co-author, what we did is we divided in this graph the observation according to whether a place is in Upper Canada or Lower Canada. And the places in blue are in Upper Canada, and the places in red are in Lower Canada. Notice what's happening here. The Upper Canadas have lots of observation that are actually in like a high land quality area, but there's a lot, they're just systematically higher at the same level of land quality as the Lower Canada place. So let's take, for example, this guy here or this guy here and compare them with the places in Upper Canada, so the blue colored one. They're all above it, nearly all above it. Even the highest quality land in Lower Canada, like these guys here, are pretty much all below the top guys. So it seems that it's not that it's land that matters, because if it was land, you would expect that you could find a Upper Canada here, a Lower Canada here, an Upper Canada here. But on average, you'd have more Upper Canadas in this section here and lots of Lower Canada in this section here around the fifth. You shouldn't have something like this where there's a bunch of them above. There's clearly a problem in this where alone the land quality is not explaining something. And true enough, when we do a regression test, where what we do is in two steps. The first step we do is we check whether or not land quality reduces, so lower. So if that number goes up, right, that means that the land quality is inferior. And what is the effect of having worse land on real wages? It appears that it's statistically significant. However, once you modify that first regression to add two things. The first one is you add whether or not an observation is within Upper Canada rather than being in Lower Canada. So this is known in econometrics as a dummy variable. It's either 0 or 1, and it's 1 if it's in Upper Canada and 0 if it's in Lower Canada. And the other thing we do is we add an interaction term. And the idea is we multiply this guy by this guy. Normally, if there was something about Upper Canada that was also about land quality, you should see that having better land within Upper Canada should lead to greater productivity. So there should be a positive effect of having better land within Canada, within Upper Canada. While the sign is not only not significant, because the little stars here denote that the effect is statistically significant, and I forgot to say the level here. This is significant at the 99% level. So it's clearly different from 0. However, this one is not significant because this is the guy we're interested in. Not only is it not significant, it actually has the opposite sign to what you'd expect. So you can kind of throw away this idea that it's land quality. There is something that this regression tells us, is that something unique to Upper Canada, which is not land quality, is driving all the differences in real wages. So what is it? Well, there's another explanation that we have to kill before we kind of answer what is it. Because one of the things that people used to say is, it could be that Upper Canada is just so advantaged in terms of its ability to produce for foreign markets. So it sells all its wheat to Britain. And this wheat that it sells to Britain and the United States, on these markets, the prices are much higher. And because the prices are much higher, the wheat sold on those markets provide large revenues. These large revenues stimulate capital formation. It stimulates savings, and everybody's happy. There's fast economic growth. That explanation is very weak, right? The first reason why is in part because we've kind of attacked the geography one. If the land quality is not that much of a deal in deriving real wage differences, it also means that since real wages are a proxy for productivity, well then, heck, we can't exactly state that that land quality, that wheat is going to matter, because the gain in productivity itself was premised on having better land. And better land meant lower cost. Lower cost meant greater export ability to export. Here it's telling us that no, it's not about land. But the other part that really kills it is the finding from a guy called Douglas McCullough. McCullough found that wheat was never more than 50% of the revenues that farm obtained from market sale. Now, mind you, that's not 50%, and actually, it used to be closer to 20%. But actually, what McCullough points out that he adds to this is not only is it that it's not like a very big share. It's not a very big share of what is a very small share of total farm activity. Because notice here, I say true market sale. Farmers didn't sell all their crops. They consumed some of it. So they did grow some stuff for themselves. So that share of what they sold was not their total output. So that means that if, say, it's closer to 20% of their output that is sold is wheat, that actually means that wheat is an even smaller share of their total output. And so you're kind of forced to say, no, wheat isn't the explanation. There's actually two other things that suggest that this argument that wheat was like a source of export revenues. The other part is that the wheat, the other two reasons is that the wheat wasn't exported to Britain or the United States. It was exported in large quantities to the neighboring Lower Canada, where, yes, prices for food were higher. So sorry, there's a typo here. Prices were higher. That basically meant that they were able to provide wheat at relatively low prices in Lower Canada, but not that, like the difference in prices was not as big as the one with England. Uh, but Lower Canada had a comparative advantage in timber related production. And the idea was that the Upper Canadians would trade wheat with the Lower Canadians. So the Lower Canadians would buy wheat from the Upper Canadians, and the Lower Canadians would earn more by specializing in the production of wood products, which would then be shipped to England for a much higher price than the wheat would have itself fetched, given the amount of inputs that it required to produce. So this advantage meant that it's not wheat that's the main export on British market. Timber is. Timber is the most important thing, and it is indeed, and it's underestimated as a source of production, because the French Canadians in Lower Canada not only exported wood itself and some manufactured wood, they also built ships, which they then sold to England, which was a way of converting wood as a good to Britain. And often what they did is that they built a ship, filled it with wood, brought it to Britain, sold the wood, and sold the ship. So this is essentially what was happening in that period. So you can't really say that the export of wheat to British market is a big deal. The third reason is that what's remained of what was sold of the wheat that was produced in Ontario was actually used for local consumption, especially in the cities. So that story about wheat is riddled with holes that just doesn't make it fly. So what's left? Well, this is where institutions come into play. Now, remember that when we discussed the institution of seigneurial tenure in Lower Canada, I gave you the result that the wages within Lower Canada, all right, so this is important. The results that I gave you for Lower Canada compared places under seigneurial tenure within Lower Canada with places that were non-seigneurial tenure also within Lower Canada. So you were comparing within Quebec, essentially, which is Lower Canada. When we were comparing them within the same place, what you found was that the places that were non-seigneurial had wages that were between 18 and 47% higher than in seigneurial places. But the thing is that the non-seigneurial places represented less than 20% of Lower Canada's population. When I say less than 20%, that's like exactly it, less than 20%. And the seigneurial areas represented the remaining 80%. Well, the thing is that these proportions are really important, because if you are to remove the difference, the high wage non-seigneurial places from Lower Canada, the difference between the Lower Canada with only seigneurial places is exactly the same as that number here. So essentially what we're saying here is that the near totality of the gap between Upper Canada and Lower Canada is explained by seigneurial places. Seigneurial tenure explains the vast majority of the differences between the two places. When I say the vast majority, I should say the lion's share, the near totality, the virtual totality. It's a really big deal, because we're saying that one institution explains the entire difference between Upper and Lower Canada. And also, we'd said a few slides ago that Quebec alone explains the vast majority of the difference between Canada and the United States. Well, that also means that by equivalence, that the majority of the gap between Canada and the United States is explained by one institution in Lower Canada. That is a big finding. It's a big finding because the other part that's important is that Upper Canada never had that institution. Upper Canada had a much freer labor market than Lower Canada had, and thus had greater industrial vibrancy. But there's another effect that comes in from this is that uh, Lower Canada, by having the institution of seigneurial tenure, uh, also probably discouraged the formation of human capital in comparison to Upper Canada. And the reason why is, and this is going to set the stage for not only differences in level, but differences in growth rate. Because why would you acquire an extra year of education generally? Because an extra year of education leads to greater income, right? This is why you would go to school. But what happens if the place you live in has an institution that reduces your wage rates? Well, if it reduces your wage rate, it also reduces your returns to education. And if we assume that the cost to education are the same everywhere, right? So it's the same financial cost that you have to defray. Well, then it means that actually, all else being equal, you're probably going to have a a lesser incentive to invest in education in the place with the lower wages because of the nature of senior tenure than in the place with higher wages. And this is what we see. This is a comparison here of attendance rates in schools. And you can see that for Upper Canada, attendance rates grow very fast. And this is the share of the population from 6 to 15. Sorry, this one is the share of the population from 6 to 15 who is in school, right? So it starts from the low 20s to high 90s. And in fact, when you keep going down the list, there's never less than 80% by 1870. There's never less than 80% of kids from 6 to 15 who are in school. That is massive. In contrast, in Quebec, it's generally around 50%. That is a big deal. And the reason why is because of the dynamic nature of the Ontario labor market for Upper Canada. The wages, the prospect for higher wages incentivized investment in human capital, which in turn fueled economic growth and set the stage for long-term differences in living standards. So here you have it. We are done with the Upper Canada explanation. You can see that it's kind of a mirror story of what we have said in the two last lecture regarding Lower Canada. Because here we confirm that a place that uh, didn't have seigneurial tenure grew incredibly rich. And we've ruled out explanations that are due to exogenous factor like geography. We've we've ruled them out, and we've ruled out some additional things about the wheat market. And so what we're left with as nearly sole explanation is this role that seigneurial tenure plays between the two places. And that, I think, confirms what I've been trying to tell you since lecture five is that institutions are going to explain are the key to explain the differences between Canada and the United States. So that's it for today. I'm going to wish you a happy week. Everyone, keep safe, enjoy your time, and see you next time.